Educational Communications and this station present Environmental Directions with Nancy Pearlman. On this series, we explore the effects of human influence on the Earth's ecosystems and discuss solutions to environmental problems which affect the quality of life on this planet. Environmental Directions gives you the kind of information you need to help you participate in decisions impacting your community, the nation, and the world. Now, here's your host, Nancy Pearlman.
Hello. For the next half hour, we are going to be talking about gardening with native plants and for resilience with my guest, Pam Penick. She is founder of Garden Spark, which is a speaker series on design and ecology. She is a garden writer, a speaker, advocate for climate resilient design, and former owner of a landscape design business. She has authored many books, including Long Gone, The Water-Saving Garden, and her most recent book, Gardens of Texas, Visions of Resilience from the Lone Star State, with photography by Kenny Braun. She has also had articles in many publications, including Better Homes and Gardens, American Gardener, and others. Her website is Digging. Welcome. It's a pleasure to have you with us.
Thank you, Nancy. I'm really happy to be here talking with you.
I am just thrilled to tell people that they should get this gorgeous book of Gardens of Texas, because it's not just about Texas. It's about beautiful plants, beautiful ways to make your landscape around your homes and offices gorgeous. You have done a wonderful job in presenting over 27 gardens as case studies. You've gone around to different parts of Texas. What was your major theme in terms of what gardens you chose to highlight?
Thank you for those kind words about the book, Nancy. I am really happy with how it turned out, and Kenny did do an amazing job with the photos. Picking the gardens was kind of a challenging exercise because Texas is so huge. Like California, it is just a physically large state, and I live in Austin, which is in the central part of the state, so I'm pretty familiar with a lot of gardens here and people who are in the garden design business. But when I was starting to look outside of central Texas, I knew I was going to have to really reach out to a lot of contacts around the state. One of the things that people always say about gardeners is how generous they are and how sharing, and that definitely was true. So many people helped me find connections to gardeners and to designers around the state. They sent me links. They said, I know somebody, and so many people that I've only met through email really helped me with the process. And then once I had connected with people around the state, I drove out to the various parts of Texas. For the purpose of my book, I divided Texas into 5 broad regions, and I knew I wanted to get good representation from each of the regions. Texas is big, so I ended up driving 6,000 miles to make this book. I did scouting trips and visited gardens and then made my selections based on really 3 criteria. I was looking, obviously, for beautiful gardens, and then when I spoke with the garden makers, either the homeowner or their designer, I wanted to find out the story of that garden. I wanted to know the stories, why they were gardening, why the garden is meaningful to them, anything interesting that they're doing in terms of adapting to the climate shifts that we're all seeing. Then, within those parameters, the final criteria I used was to represent the diversity of types of gardens and types of garden makers that I was seeing across the whole state. I really wanted to capture a sense of all the possibilities.
You certainly succeeded, because I found it inspirational. At first I thought, oh, why should I care about gardens in Texas? But in reading about how people decided to create their gardens, in reading about and seeing the pictures and learning about what we can do, it's really relevant regardless of where we are in the United States.
I totally agree, because the stories, they're specific to those people, but they're also universal. Each of us who gardens has something that draws us to it, right? When you read about what draws other people to it, it can be very inspiring, or it can open your eyes to something that you hadn't thought about before, no matter where they are.
It was interesting that some of the places had many acres, and yet others were literally in town with just an acre. And yet when you looked at their garden, it seemed as though they had much more land. And a universal factor that I noticed was they didn't have wasteful peaceful lawns that were water guzzlers, that were not native. They had beautiful flowers from many different species, and of course in the southern area, a lot of them used agave and prickly pear and sage and ferns and yuccas and all those beautiful plants that had beautiful flowers when it was the right time to bloom.
Yes, I think Texas gardeners have been on the forefront for a long, long time in thinking about smart water use. As we know, lawns are typically water guzzlers, especially on the western side of the state. We get a lot less rain than on the eastern side. I mean, the rain across Texas can range from close to 50 inches on the southeast side to 15 inches on the west. It really depends on where you live. But even across all those regions, I did notice that gardeners are really looking for alternatives to lawn.
I mentioned that none of these had European grass lawns, but you do encourage to have people plant, where possible, some of the native grasses that used to cover all of Texas prairies. They are beautiful too.
They are. We have a lot of shortgrass prairie grasses that we can use, and people are being more and more creative about that. It used to be that if you wanted what they call a native lawn, you would pretty much choose buffalo grass, and one of the gardens featured in the book, I do show a fairly good-sized buffalo grass lawn, which is left long. It's not mowed regularly. I think it's just beautiful because it really has that kind of tufted prairie look. But there are other options that people are also using because buffalo grass has some shortcomings of its own. It can be overgrown with Bermuda grass, which is an invasive grass that wants to take over the world here in Texas. There are other mixtures of short grass, native grasses that people are putting together to make natural lawns, and I love that. There was even a branded variety called Habiturf that the Lady Bird Johnson Wildflower Center developed and still sells via seed, and you can sow that and create a lawn that is good for walking on and playing on and hardly needs to be mowed, hardly needs to be watered once it's established, of course. The lawn serves a purpose, and there are plenty of people in the world who enjoy a lawn and who don't want to have to give up a lawn because they use it, they get enjoyment out of it. I wrote a book called Lawn Gone. I'm not anti-lawn myself. I see that it serves a purpose, but the nice thing is there are other options that you can look into that aren't the traditional thirsty turf grasses. There are many more options, and if you don't need a lawn for playing soccer on or heavy use, that opens up even more options for lawn alternatives like sedges, creeping ground covers, that sort of thing.
There were lots of pathways and various places where people could sit and enjoy the out of doors and watch the wildlife, because you had these people who encouraged native plants that brought in the native insects, which brought in the native birds, which brought in the deer and all the other creatures in the area. Did you find that it was difficult for them to encourage the insects to come to their garden?
That was one of the common themes that I heard over and over again, was people were excited, maybe people who were gardening for the first time were excited about the plants. They were excited to put in these different plants, and what several of them told me specifically was they did not expect or anticipate how much wildlife would respond to having those plants, and they were thrilled. They were looking outside for the first time and just seeing their yard full of bird life and insect life of all kinds, where before they just didn't have any of that activity, and it was thrilling to them. And those stories really resonated with me because gardening for wildlife is one of the primary joys I get from my own garden. So yeah, I think some people did start out specifically gardening for wildlife, but there were plenty who did not, and they were really thrilled to see how much life the garden could bring into their world.
Gardens that have native plants encourage native wildlife, both the small critters, the insects, as well as the larger animals like the deer.
Yeah, we need to help the pollinators because I keep reading these stories about how we've had so much pollinator decline and so much like songbird decline. That's directly the result of loss of habitat. If we can provide even a little patch, and that was something that one of the gardeners, Jim Martinez in Marfa, told me. He said, even if you can just plant, your yard provides a small patch of these plants that they are now missing that used to fill your region, and maybe now it's cattle rangeland or it's farmland, and so they don't have those plants anymore. But your garden can become that oasis for them. If we take that and apply it to our own home landscapes, and we think about, I'll plant this little 100 square foot patch with native plants for pollinators, for other wildlife, and then maybe my neighbor will do a little patch down the street and another neighbor around the block. That creates important habitat that those wildlife can use. Maybe on their migration, Texas is on the migration path for so many bird species, and the monarch butterflies come through on their way down to Mexico for the winter. They need those pathways. That's something that we can provide for them. I think that's pretty inspiring.
Some of the homeowners used recycled material, including even concrete, which I thought would be ugly, but it looked beautiful in the pathways.
Mm-hmm. I thought that was great too. That was a Dallas gardener that you're talking about who used broken up chunks of concrete for his large stairways through his garden and to build up retaining walls. It has a funny name. People call it urbanite, as if it were like a quartz or something like that, but it's just a rock-like name for broken up concrete. It works well, and the beauty of using urbanite or broken up recycled concrete is that you're not tossing it into a landfill. So he was able to get his hands on some because he works with a landscape architect company and they have access to it when they do demos in people's yards. So he was able to bring that home and recycle it in his own garden. It's really creative, I thought.
Others incorporated interesting artwork, including benches and tables that weren't traditional.
Yes, there are all sorts of really cool designs that people are incorporating, whether they're like a big slab of limestone on a couple of other pieces of limestone to make a really natural bench that blends in with the landscape, or people in South Texas especially were using a lot of faux bois, which I wasn't familiar with before I started writing this book. But faux bois, which means like fake wood, is a craft that came up from Mexico, and before that from Argentina, and before that from Europe, and it kind of traveled this route from south to north to San Antonio. And there are masters there who create faux bois. I think every garden that I visited in the San Antonio area had a piece of faux bois, whether it was a bench or a fountain, just really unique pieces. They're made of concrete, but they're made to resemble natural or like planed wood, and it's beautiful. And it was just one of those distinctive regional garden decor items that really jumped out at me.
I want to have you explain the layout of your book, because in Gardens of Texas, Visions of Resilience from the Lone Star State, you were very consistent in how you presented these vastly different places. You started with descriptions of the people and what they wanted and why they got involved. You have pictures of their home and some of the plants. Then you have a full layout of some of the garden with the different plants. You show who the owners are. They get to have their portrait in there. And then you have close-ups of flowers. The close-ups are absolutely beautiful of each plant, and more pictures of different angles from the garden. And then it just continues with pictures where I love in each of the 27 gardens that you feature, you have one page of the native pollinator plants for the area, and you describe the 9 flowering plants. Then you also describe how you or the reader can try something in their home. This was a wonderful way of presenting each home consistently, but yet it was so different because each place was so different.
Yeah, that's what I noticed. I wanted to have, of course, gardens from each region, and then when I was telling the story of each garden, and I did want to tell the story, right? There are pages, like 14 pages for many of the gardens, of photos. These are big photos, so people can really get a sense of what it would be like to walk through that garden and explore that garden. Then I interviewed, of course, each gardener and was able to write a short essay about each one, just telling the story of what it all means to them and how they are adapting their garden and making it more resilient. And then I brought that home at the end of each section, like you point out, to the reader. Something that jumped out at me from each garden, I made it into a page that I called Try This at Home. And it might be a design tip, like for one garden, it's how to make a crevice garden that is tough enough to withstand the Texas heat, because crevice gardens, you typically think of those as alpine. But this gardener was able to make one that reflects the climate that he's in. And then I pulled out 9 plants from that region that would be something that the reader could take home to their their own garden if they lived in the same area that he or she did. So I really did want to give plenty of take-home material for people, so no matter where they live, as they're reading this book, it might be something they can incorporate in their own garden or just be inspired by what other people are doing. When you're covering an area that's this large, you know that not every plant that you feature for a particular garden is going to be applicable to everybody who reads it. But I think it gives people a greater sense of what that garden is growing, and then they can take that home to theirs, or they can flip to the next page and see if those plants are more suitable for their garden.
It seemed as though everybody wanted to preserve their ancient oak trees, and they designed their homes and the pathways and the various things to do in the garden around the trees that were not to be cut down. And we know oak trees are so important and must be preserved. How old were some of those trees?
In one of the gardens, Colson Bruce's garden here in Austin, he had an arborist look at his really amazing heritage live oak and estimate that it was about 400 years old, I think it was. And I'm sure there were some similar to that just based on the size in two of the gardens that I photographed in San Antonio. Yeah, this part of Texas really does have incredible live oaks, mostly escarpment live oaks. Those trees really do play a very important ecological role, and Texans value their trees, as I'm sure you do in California, for the shade and creating a little cool microclimate under the trees. So we're very much into protecting our trees. We treasure them here.
You want to treasure all your wonderful native plants and present them so that people can enjoy them. Your book is wonderful, and we're going to talk more about the gardens of Texas with my guest, Pam Penick, when we return in a moment.
Environmental Directions with Nancy Pearlman continues with further discussion of the world's critical ecological issues. For more information, you may call 310-559-9160 or go to www.ecoprojects.org. Now, here's Nancy.
I'm speaking with Pam Penick, who has authored Gardens of Texas, Visions of Resilience from the Lone Star State. You are a garden writer. You've worked in the landscape design business. You want people to appreciate the importance of gardens. But yet, in addition to some of your own photographs, you actually worked with the photographer Kenny Braun. How did that process work about which plants to take? Because I know one of the gardens, you got there at the wrong time of the year and they weren't blooming. You had to actually use the homeowners' pictures.
That was an East Texas garden that we shot in early April. And it's kind of a funny story about that. My husband had planned a long RV trip for us. He was planning it out like a year before I found out that I was going to be doing this book. The trip was for April through part of May. Well, here I am suddenly realizing I'm going to be writing this garden book because the publisher said yes to my project. The prime time for shooting gardens, I was going to be in an RV. That was an unexpected twist in my book writing experience. But Kenny Braun is a landscape photographer. He knows Texas. He knows the Texas climate. It was really a match made in heaven to get him for the photography for my book. And we traveled to all the gardens together to shoot them, including the one in East Texas where there was a surprise late freeze. And that garden owner, Jared Barnes, he was such a trooper. He knew the freeze was coming and he knew I was going to be there in about 3 weeks. He said he was taking his wife's bins from the container store and throwing them over everything, and doing things that he wouldn't normally do because his garden was going to be in photographs. So I really appreciated all his efforts. And in fact, when we got there, I mean, his garden did actually look beautiful. He had his early flowers were up. What I noticed was he had pollinators everywhere on his plants, so many pollinators. So they really appreciated his efforts in saving those plants from that late frost that year. And I did use his photos to capture a glimpse of his garden at other times of the year when it would be even more flowery and beautiful. I was glad that he was able to share those. But other than his, we had pretty good luck considering the crazy-making weather that Texas had been experiencing. Starting back in 2021, we had that huge snow and freeze event that I know made national news, and so many people lost so many plants throughout their landscapes. Then, like the year that I was starting to shoot this, we had a tremendously devastating devastating ice storm here in central Texas where I live, and trees were just breaking left and right, and I thought, oh no, there will go all the gardens that I can photograph in this area. But a few months go by and plants are pretty resilient, and one of the things that I noticed was the gardens bounced back. People made amazing efforts to help their gardens look beautiful, of course, for the photos, and I appreciated that. But they could do that because their gardens were built for this kind of resilience, and that impressed me over and over again, really how much plants, they want to live, right? And they want to do all the things that they are programmed to do, and you can have some crazy making weather and they can still come back. The gardens might be a little thinner, and I mentioned that in my introduction. Like, a lot of people, when I was touring their gardens, mentioned, oh, I've lost this and this, but that's okay. I'm embracing that because maybe the garden is 15, 20 years old now. It was starting to become a little overgrown. Mother Nature came along and thinned it out for me, and I kind of like it. I thought that was a really healthy way to look at it, to say, I'm not just going to come back and replant all that stuff. Actually, I like this new open look. But I think that's a really good mental shift.
While you feature the gardens, it's important that people have their structures, their homes or their offices or buildings that the gardens are around be incorporated into the garden, that they are unique and special in and of themselves, that they're just not plopped there. Isn't there a relationship between the built environment and the natural environment?
Absolutely, and several of the gardeners did talk explicitly about how they organize their garden to line up with the views out of their house, so that when they're looking out their windows, they feel that they're in the garden, so that paths lead to those doorways. That's really important, and it's so easy to forget when you first start. But I think the example shown here will encourage people to give a little more thought to that design idea, to make their homes part of that garden, because the reality is you're not in your garden as much as you're in your home, most likely. You want to look out your kitchen window while you're washing dishes, or look out your office window while you're sitting at your computer, like I'm doing right now, and see the garden and feel like you're part of it, because that's going to give you so much pleasure and joy, even when you can't be outside every minute of the day.
Well, most of the descriptions of the gardens are about how decisions were made to plant, what kind of design. The photographs are close-ups of different pathways and areas, particularly of the flowers and the trees. Occasionally, you showed some beautiful skies with beautiful clouds.
Yes, the skies, especially in West Texas, blew me away. They have a monsoon season there, and we were there at the end of the monsoon season, so there were still clouds in the sky, and the desert skies are dry and bright, so we did get some amazing skies and some rainbows.
I was surprised that there weren't more people having their vegetable garden. You did feature a few that raised some of their own food. Was there a reason for that?
Many people probably did. I couldn't include, of course, all the areas of every garden because of space limitations. That's probably just what it was. I would say that probably a good 60 or 70% were growing some sort of food in their gardens. I will confess that my great love is ornamental gardening myself, and so I might have been inclined to show more of that. I love design, and I love native plants.
You weren't able to often capture the wildlife that came into these gardens, but you do have some pictures of some chickens.
We did get pictures of chickens at that farm in South Texas, which was fun. Of course, they're raising the chickens for the eggs, and they had a goat as well. But you would be surprised as you start really pouring through the photos how many insect photos we did get. I was always pointing out bees and butterflies and birds and lizards to my photographer, Kenny Braun, and he was great at capturing those images.
I'm wondering how many of these native pollinator plants you've included, or the waterwise plants, because I'm just looking at the page where you have close-ups of the flowers for each garden, 9 pictures, 1 yellow bells, cliff morning glory, datura, devil's claw, Darcy sage, daisies, patchy plum, western sistrum, Mexican buckeye, sages, asters, yucca. I can hardly mention them all, but the flowers are stunning. How many native plants are there to choose from? I know that First Lady Bird Johnson Johnson was very active in promoting native plants of Texas. And of course, here in California, we're promoting native plants. And I'm surprised that some of these plants we find here in California, from the yuccas to the sages to the cactus.
Yeah, I was so excited to see all these plants too. And many of them I didn't know either. Some of the plants I already knew about, but others were completely new to me. And I do think that's one of the fun things about flipping through the book, is seeing that diversity represented. Lady Bird Johnson did really encourage people across the country, no matter where they live. She wanted their region to look like their region by growing native plants. Texas has been on the forefront of that. I mean, she obviously was here. She founded the Lady Bird Johnson Wildflower Center right here in Austin. It's our state botanic garden. They only grow plants that are native in Texas, although their mission is much larger than that. It's to encourage people everywhere to grow plants that are native to their area. Not exclusively. It's nothing hardcore. It's that this brings diversity. This protects plants that may be endangered. It provides food for the native wildlife and habitat. The most important reason, maybe, when you're walking through the Lady Bird Johnson Wildflower Center, is just to see how gorgeous it is. It really represents Texas. And when you do it in California, then it represents California, and it makes you realize the beauty of your state and what it has to offer, instead of every place just looking the same.
She also advocated that we should have native plants, regardless of where we live, that were appropriate for that particular site.
Yes, Lady Bird Johnson really did advocate for that. She wanted every region to look like itself, and not like maybe the 12 or 20 plants that are available on the shelves of the big box store. When you're growing native plants that are native to your region, you're helping your state's natural beauty shine through. And then that also creates habitat for native wildlife that depend on those plants. It's just a win-win, and it doesn't have to be all or nothing, as many of the gardeners in my book pointed out. It doesn't have to be that you only plant native plants. Just start off with a few. And even if you're gardening in an apartment, you can put a few native plants in a pot on the balcony, and you will see wildlife come to those plants because maybe they depend on that particular plant to get food or to create a place to lay their eggs.
Your book, Gardens of Texas, Visions of Resilience from the Lone Star State, is gorgeous. I hope everybody gets a copy of it. It belongs on the coffee table. You can just enjoy the inspiration from seeing beautiful yards that are more than just a tree or a plant. You featured 27 gardens as case studies. I didn't count how many flowers and trees and other plants you featured. Do you have a count?
Now you're going to have me going back through the book and trying to count them all. It has to be hundreds. I'm glad you noticed that, because it does make me happy to have such good representation.
And of course, you encourage plants that are not water guzzlers, that are definitely those that blend with the landscape and with the other plants. I'm wondering how many other gardens you can feature. I think there's a sequel or two coming.
I think I need a part 2. I like that idea.
When you were visiting these gardens, what surprised you the most?
Probably my visits to gardens in West Texas, far West Texas. It was an area that I didn't know much about. It's pretty far from here. It's a good 6-7 hour drive, and there aren't big cities out there, so it just hadn't been a place that I had driven through very often. So I didn't know much about it. And I got out there, and I found so many gardeners and garden designers making really remarkable gardens in what is essentially a desert landscape. They are aware that it's a desert. They are being very thoughtful about the water use to maintain their gardens. They're using plants that are very well suited for the Chihuahuan Desert, which goes through that part of West Texas. I was just really bowled over by the diversity of the kind of gardens that I saw out there, and thrilled to see how much creative garden making was going on. That was the place that I really learned the most about.
Even though I'm in California and you're in Texas, there's so much sharing that can happen when we learn about other places. We can adapt them to our own locale.
I just really appreciate your interest in this book. I know you're not in the same gardening area that I am, but I think California and Texas do share an interest in gardening ecologically and preserving the beauty of our state and helping the wildlife. Anybody who's interested in that will enjoy seeing what these gardeners are doing, and I really appreciate the opportunity to share it with you.
I am so pleased that you have provided these beautiful gardens in your book so that all of us can enjoy them if we can't visit them directly. Thank you so very much for sharing information information about how we can all make beautiful yards where we live and work. Thank you for being my guest.
Thank you so much, Nancy. I really enjoyed talking with you.
I have been speaking with Pam Penick, who is a garden writer, speaker, advocate for climate resilient design, founder of Garden Spark, and author of Gardens of Texas, Visions of Resilience from the Lone Star State. I'm Nancy Perlman. Thank you for joining us, and do tune in again next week.
If you would like free information about these environmental issues, go to www.ecoprojects.org or call 310-559-9160. Environmental Directions with your host, Nancy Perlman, is a community affairs program of the nonprofit organization Educational Communications and this station.